She had watched him fall, physically and otherwise, more times than she could count. But nothing prepared Tracy Pollen for the moment she would have to confront the question that no wife should ever have to ask. Is this what you want? By 1998, the Parkinson's diagnosis that had arrived 7 years earlier had taken its toll in ways no one outside their home could possibly understand. The actor who once made millions laugh as Marty McFly had begun drinking to escape a reality he couldn't accept, and Tracy had become, in many ways, a single mother to their children, while also caring for a husband who was slowly disappearing into himself. Those who watched Michael J. Fox on television saw the same charismatic performer, but behind closed doors at their Connecticut home, something was crumbling. Tracy had carried the weight of his diagnosis in silence, never once wavering when he told her the news in 1991. In sickness and in health, she had said without blinking. She meant it, but she hadn't anticipated that the sickness would manifest not only in tremors, but in the gradual erosion of the man she married. The night she finally confronted him, she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply looked at him and said those terrifying words that would change everything. And in that silence, Michael J. Fox realized something he'd been avoiding for years. His burden had become hers. But that was only the beginning of a reckoning that would force them both to confront what marriage truly meant when the fairy tale ended. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe so you never miss our next documentary. The morning of June 1992 began like any other in the Fox household, until their 3-year-old son Sam wandered into the living room and found his father unconscious on the sofa, an empty can of beer still clutched in his hand. What happened next would become the defining moment of their marriage, the reckoning that forced both of them to look into the abyss and decide whether they would jump together or apart. Tracy Pollen had spent the previous year watching her husband disappear, not into the physical tremors of Parkinson's, but into something far more insidious. Michael had been diagnosed in 1991, just 3 years into their marriage, and had spent every day since trying to outrun the diagnosis through the bottom of a bottle. What had once been social drinking transformed into something darker. He would wait until Tracy fell asleep, then slip out of bed to drink alone, isolate himself from the very people who could have saved him. Empty bottles began appearing in hidden corners of their home, silent evidence of a man drowning in his own fear. When Michael awoke that morning, he braced himself for fury. He had seen her angry before, had earned it with his silences and his disappearances into addiction. But when he scanned from her feet to her face, he found something far more terrifying than rage. She was simply bored. Tracy Pollen, the woman who had held him when he received the diagnosis and promised that nothing had changed, had reached what she later described as the end of her rope. She looked at the man she had married and asked a question so devastating it still echoes decades later. Is this what you want? This is what you want to be. And then she walked out the door. Those 3 words, is this what you want, struck Michael J. Fox with the force of physical blow. He had expected anger, had prepared himself for it, but resignation was something else entirely. In that moment, he understood that his silence about his illness had not protected Tracy. It had enslaved her to his suffering. She had become a single mother in all but name, raising their son and caring for a husband who was slowly killing himself while pretending everything was fine. He had made her bear a trial that was never hers to endure. What happened in the weeks that followed was nothing short of miraculous. Michael J. Fox never had another drink after that morning. He began seeing a therapist to learn healthier ways to process his diagnosis, to stop alienating the family that was desperate to help him. The man who had been hiding from his own life finally began showing up for it. But while the drinking stopped, the reckoning had only just begun. Behind closed doors, another conversation was unfolding, one that would force Michael to confront not just his addiction, but something far more painful, the guilt of what he had done to the woman who chose to stay. Tracy Pollen opened the front door and stepped out into the Connecticut morning, leaving behind a question that would echo through their marriage for decades. Is this what you want to be? She had not walked out permanently that June morning in 1992. But the message had been delivered with devastating clarity, and Michael J. Fox understood that he stood at a crossroads that would determine the rest of his life. What happened in the aftermath of that morning was nothing short of a transformation. Fox never had another drink after that day. But sobriety was only the first step in a much longer journey. The drinking, he later admitted, had been his way of trying to disassociate from a reality he simply could not accept. For 7 years after getting sober, he remained in denial about his diagnosis, telling only a small circle of people and continuing to work as if nothing had changed. The man who had been told he had only 10 years left to work refused to believe it. Yet behind the scenes, something far more complex was unfolding. Fox began seeing a therapist to address not just his addiction, but the emotional isolation that had nearly destroyed his family. He had made a devastating realization. His silence about his illness had not protected Tracy from his suffering. Instead, it had made her a slave to it as well. In trying to shield her from his pain, he had condemned her to bear it alone. What Tracy Pollan did during those years has never been fully understood by those who only saw the public face of their marriage. She never stopped being the woman who, when Fox broke the news of his diagnosis in 1991, simply held him and said, "You're not any different than you were yesterday. Nothing's changed." She never blinked, as Fox would later say through tears. But that unwavering support came at a cost that she carried in silence. "She was there in the front lines with me every single day," Fox recalled years later. And in a statement that revealed the depth of his guilt, he added, "At any time, she would have been forgiven to say, 'I'm just going to step out.' But she didn't do that." He would have understood if she had. That is the measure of what he had put her through. But Tracy had her own perspective on what kept them together through the darkest years. She believed it was their ability to truly listen to one another, to give each other space when needed, and to assume that each was doing the best that I can. Humor became their unexpected weapon against despair. Fox described how Tracy could find the funny even in his most difficult moments, telling him stories about mundane errands while he lay on the floor after a fall, refusing to let tragedy define their lives. The weight of devotion is invisible to the outside world. No one saw the sleepless nights, the quiet fears, the moments when Tracy Pollan must have wondered if she could continue carrying a burden that was never meant to be hers alone. But she did continue, because she had made a promise, and because the man she married was finally learning to show up for his own life. If this story surprised you, share it with someone who would enjoy uncovering forgotten Hollywood stories. Decades later, sitting across from Howard Stern in a September 2013 interview, Michael J., Fox finally confessed something he had carried alone for years. He told the world about the morning his wife found him, about the boredom in her eyes that cut deeper than any anger ever could. He was sharing the most humiliating moment of his life with millions of strangers. But there was something else he revealed that day, a confession that had been buried even deeper. He would have forgiven her if she had left. "My first reaction to the diagnosis was to start drinking heavily," Fox admitted to Stern. "I used to drink to party, but now I was drinking alone and every day." The distancing behavior had done exactly what he had been trying to avoid. His wife had become a slave to his suffering, as he would later phrase it in his autobiography. The silence about his illness, intended to protect her, had instead trapped her in a world of fear and uncertainty with no way out. "I made her a single mother, and I took her out of the game," Fox told CBC News, reflecting on their life together. He recalled that Tracy had been a young actress with a promising career when they married. Her career was hopping. She was doing great. She was beautiful. And yet, she had stepped away from all of it, raising their 4 children while navigating the chaos of a husband spiraling into addiction. The guilt of that realization stayed with Fox for decades. But what Fox would later admit in a CBS Mornings interview was perhaps the most stunning confession of all. At any time, she would have been forgiven to say, "I'm just going to step out." But she didn't do that. He meant it. He had pushed her to the brink, had tested the limits of, in sickness and in health, in ways that would have broken most marriages. And he would have understood if she had walked away for good. But Tracy Pollan didn't leave. Instead, she did something far more difficult. She stayed. And in staying, she refused to let him continue hiding from the truth of what he had become. The confession Fox made to the world was not just about his drinking. It was about finally accepting that his burden had become hers, and that the only way forward was to share it openly. "I was isolating myself from my family," Fox admitted, and in that isolation, he had nearly lost everything that mattered: The therapy that followed, the Alcoholics Anonymous meetings he attended, the gradual acceptance of his diagnosis, all of it began with a single, devastating question from a wife who had reached her limit. What came next would surprise even those closest to them, because when Fox finally stopped running from his reality, he discovered something he never expected. The foundation he built, the advocacy work that would define his legacy, the billions raised for Parkinson's research, all of it was born from the ashes of that morning on the living room floor. And it was Tracy who held the match that lit the fire. If this story surprised you, share it with someone who would enjoy uncovering forgotten Hollywood stories. Michael J. Fox and Tracy Pollan stood before 800 people at Cipriani's South Street in November 2025, celebrating 25 years of the foundation that had become their shared legacy. The Parkinson's diagnosis that once threatened to destroy them had, against all odds, become the bedrock of a partnership that refused to break. But what the audience didn't see that night was a private conversation that had happened just hours before, when Tracy looked at her husband and whispered something that captured the unspoken truth of their 40 years together. Every day is a holiday, Fox wrote on their 38th anniversary, sharing a photograph of the two of them smiling on a patio. His caption said to the Rolling Stones, "That's how strong my love is." The word seemed almost too simple for a couple who had weathered addiction, a life-altering diagnosis, and the unimaginable weight of public scrutiny. But for Tracy, the simplicity was a point. "We just take it one day at a time, and it's worked," she told people in November 2025. The philosophy seemed almost disarmingly modest for a woman who had spent decades navigating the chaos of her husband's health while raising 4 children and maintaining her own career. Yet Tracy understood something that the world had missed. Endurance isn't built in grand gestures. It is built in the quiet moments when no one is watching. Their children, she revealed, had become her greatest allies in that endurance. Michael was diagnosed before the girls were born and very, very early into Sam's life. So it's kind of all they know, really, Tracy explained. For the Fox children, Parkinson's was not a tragedy that arrived suddenly. It was simply part of their family's fabric, something they had always navigated. They're just incredibly supportive. They're very helpful to me. I lean on them a lot, she said. But Tracy also wanted the world to understand something crucial. It's very difficult for the family, for the caregivers, and obviously for the patient. So I think it's also important to acknowledge that, and acknowledge that it's not just all sort of easy, she said. She refused to romanticize their journey. It's hard for them, but they show up and they're there for us. Her honesty cut through the carefully curated image of Hollywood perfection. This was not a marriage that had avoided pain. It was a marriage that had chosen to hold hands while walking straight through it. The vow they had made in Vermont in 1988, in sickness and in health, had been tested in ways most couples could never imagine, and they had emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. Fox, for his part, never stopped expressing his gratitude. "They've always been there for me, and they continue to be for me year after year," he said at the same gala. But he understood that the credit belonged not to him, but to the woman who had refused to let him drown. At any time, she would have been forgiven to say, "I'm just going to step out," he had admitted years earlier. But she didn't do that. At the 2026 Actor Awards, Fox stood before another audience and spoke of the greatest gift of his career, meeting Tracy Pollan on the set of Family Ties. "She gave me 4 gifts. Our kids," he said, gesturing to his son Sam, who sat beside him. The moment was tender, humorous, and utterly disarming. But underneath the charm lay something profound. Fox was not just thanking his wife for their children. He was acknowledging that she had given him his life back. The foundation they built together, celebrating its 25th anniversary in 2025, had raised over $2.5 billion for Parkinson's research. The science it funded had transformed understanding of the disease, unlocking biomarkers and treatments that had once seemed impossible. But for Fox and Tracy, the foundation was never just about the science. It was about the promise they had made to each other on that June morning in 1992, when she walked out the door and he finally understood what he was risking. Tracy's role as a board member of the foundation was not a ceremonial title. She was deeply involved in the work, and she spoke about it with the passion of someone who had watched the disease transform not only her husband's life, but her own It's all the work that they've done and all the science that has been funded and the discoveries made that is just incredibly exciting, she said. The hope and optimism she described were not abstract. They were the fruits of decades of refusing to accept defeat. And yet, for all the public achievements, the true legacy of their marriage remained invisible to the cameras. It lived in the moment when Tracy found Fox after a fall and could still make him laugh. It lived in the quiet acknowledgement that the experience was not just all sort of easy. It lived in the decision, made anew every single day, to stay. Fox once told a story about the morning he told Tracy his diagnosis. He was 29 years old, terrified, and certain that his life was over. She looked at him and said, "You're not any different than you were yesterday." In that moment, he realized that his fear had been wrong. He had not lost everything. He had gained something he had never fully appreciated. A partner who would never let him walk alone. The unbreakable vow they made was not the one spoken at their wedding. It was the one they renewed on a Connecticut living room floor when she asked the question that forced him to choose his life. And he finally did. If you enjoyed this documentary, like the video and subscribe for more true celebrity stories every week.